On China by Henry Kissinger, published in 2011. Hello, I'm Esfandiar Khodaee, and welcome to Khodaee Book Summary, where we present concise, accurate, and faithful summaries of some of the world's most important books on history, politics, and international affairs. Today, we are exploring one of the most influential books ever written about China and its place in the modern world, On China by Henry Kissinger. In 1793, a British diplomatic mission sailed to Imperial China seeking expanded trade, a permanent embassy in Beijing, and diplomatic relations on equal terms. The Qianlong Emperor replied, "We possess everything in abundance. There's nothing you can offer that we desire." The mission ended in failure. As he sailed home, the diplomat wrote in his private notes, "A couple of English frigates could destroy the entire naval force of this empire in half a summer." Half a century later, the Opium Wars proved him right. This raises two fundamental questions. How did a civilization humiliated throughout much of the 19th century become one of the world's leading powers in the 21st century? And why does China's approach to foreign policy continue to puzzle so many Western leaders and scholars? Henry Kissinger wrote the book on China to answer these two questions. In 1971, at the height of the Cold War, Kissinger made a secret trip to Beijing, becoming the first senior American official to visit People's Republic of China after more than 2 decades of hostility. The mission paved the way for normalization of relations between China and the United States. Over the following decades, he visited China more than 50 times and met 4 generations of Chinese leaders, from Mao Zedong to Zhou Enlai to Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao. On China is far more than a history of modern China. It is the work of a statesman who not only witnessed many of the events he describes, but also helped shape some of them. Kissinger argues that China is not merely a nation-state. It is a civilization with thousands of years of continuous history that long viewed itself as the center of the civilized world. To explain China's strategic culture, he contrasts 2 games, chess and Weiji, known in the West as Go. Chess seeks victory through decisive confrontation. Weiji rewards patience, strategic encirclement, and gradual accumulation of advantage. For Kissinger, these games represent 2 fundamentally different approaches to strategy. As the relationship between China and the United States increasingly shaped the international order of the 21st century, understanding China's strategic mindset has never been more important than today. About the author. Henry Kissinger was one of the most influential diplomats of the 20th century and one of the leading practitioners of political realism. Born in Germany in 1923, he immigrated to the United States after the rise of Nazi rule. He later studied and taught at Harvard University before entering government service. Serving simultaneously as U.S. National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under President Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, Kissinger played a central role in détente with the Soviet Union and in the historic opening to China. In 1973, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in negotiating the Paris Peace Accord intended to end the Vietnam War. His major works include Diplomacy, On China, World Order, and Leadership. Chapter 1: The Singularity of China. Kissinger begins with a simple but important argument. China is not an ordinary nation-state. It is a civilization state shaped by thousands of years of continuous history. Until about 1820, China produced more than 30% of world economic output. This long period of dominance created a lasting sense of civilizational exceptionalism. At the center of this tradition stood the Confucian ideal of harmony. The emperor ruled under the mandate of heaven, while rebellion or natural disasters were seen as signs that heaven had withdrawn its approval. China also viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, with neighboring states occupying a hierarchical order that was believed to preserve stability. According to Kissinger, many Western misunderstandings arise because they judge China through Western political assumptions. While the West emphasizes law, treaties, and sovereign equality, China has traditionally viewed politics as the preservation of order, balance, and civilizational continuity. Understanding this historical mindset is essential to understanding China's behavior today. Chapter 2: The Khodaee Question and the Opium War. In 1793, Lord Macartney arrived at the court of Emperor Qianlong, hoping to establish diplomatic and commercial relations. The negotiations quickly stalled over one symbolic issue: the Khodaee, the ritual of kneeling before the emperor. Macartney refused because it implied Britain's submission to Chinese superiority. Kissinger argues that the real dispute was not ceremonial but philosophical. China believed in a hierarchical world centered on itself. Britain believed in the equality of sovereign states. It was the first major collision between China's traditional worldview and a modern international system. When China later banned the opium trade, Britain responded with military force. The Opium War ended in Chinese defeat. The unequal treaties, the loss of Hong Kong, the opening of treaty ports, and foreign legal privileges marked the beginning of what Kissinger calls the century of humiliation. Forced into an international system designed by others, China developed a strategic outlook profoundly shaped by this experience. Chapter 3: From Centrality to Decline. China's defeat in the Opium War began a century of decline. But an even deeper humiliation came in 1894 when Japan defeated the Qing Empire. For centuries, China had regarded Japan as a subordinate civilization. Losing to a rapidly modernizing Japan shattered that assumption. The Boxer Rebellion followed, bringing another foreign intervention, heavy reparation, and further weakening of the Qing dynasty. The collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911 was followed by decades of civil war that ended only with the communist victory in 1949. Kissinger argues that the deepest wound was not simply military defeat. It was the loss of China's historical identity as the center of world order. This memory continues to shape Chinese attitude towards sovereignty, territorial integrity, and foreign interference. Chapter 4: Mao's Continuous Revolution. After 1949, Mao Zedong sought not merely to establish a new government, but to transform Chinese society itself. Rejecting Confucian tradition, he promoted the idea of continuous revolution, believing that permanent political struggle was necessary to prevent stagnation. This vision produced campaigns such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Kissinger portrays Mao as a deeply contradictory leader. While attacking China's traditional culture in public, he privately studied its classical texts. Although revolutionary in domestic politics, he often acted as a realist in foreign affairs, placing national interest above ideology. His domestic policies, however, came at an enormous human cost. The Great Leap Forward caused catastrophic famine. The Cultural Revolution brought years of political and social upheaval. According to Kissinger, these experiences convinced China's next generation that modernization required pragmatic reforms rather than permanent revolutions. Chapter 5: The Korean War and Triangular Diplomacy. In 1950, the United States assumed that the newly established People's Republic of China would never challenge American military power. Kissinger argues this assumption was mistaken. According to historical evidence, Mao had decided to intervene even before American forces crossed the 38th parallel. He feared that simultaneous American military presence in Korea and the Taiwan Strait would strategically encircle China. Rather than waiting, Mao intervened to alter Washington's calculation. The Korean War transformed the strategic position of all three major powers. The United States learned not to underestimate China. China demonstrated its willingness to confront a superpower. The Soviet Union discovered that Beijing was far from being a subordinate ally. Ironically, Kissinger concludes that the war eventually laid the foundation for the Sino-Soviet split and later rapprochement between China and the United States. Chapter 6: China against both superpowers. Unlike most countries during the Cold War, Mao refused to align fully with either superpower. China insisted on complete strategic independence. This policy rested on two developments. The first was the Taiwan Strait crisis. By shelling the islands of Khodaee and Matsu, Mao sought less to seize territory than to influence American strategic thinking, an example of the patient logic of Beijing. The second was the growing conflict with the Soviet Union. After Khrushchev criticized Stalin, Mao accused Moscow of abandoning revolutionary principles. Relations deteriorated until armed clashes erupted along the Usuri River in 1969. Kissinger argues that this conflict demonstrated a permanent feature of Chinese foreign policy. National interest comes before the ideological loyalty. More importantly, it convinced Mao that China's principal threat came from the Soviet Union rather than the United States. That realization opened the road to one of the greatest diplomatic realignments of the 20th century. Chapter 8: The Road to Reconciliation. In 1969, Mao asked 4 senior military marshals to reassess China's strategic position. Their conclusion was clear. The Soviet Union, not the United States, had become China's greatest security threat. At almost the same time, President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger reached a similar conclusion in Washington. The United States could not leave 1 billion Chinese in what Nixon called angry isolation. Although each side approached the problem from different strategic perspectives, both recognized that cooperation had become preferable to continued hostility. Secret contacts began through Pakistan. They were followed by ping-pong diplomacy when the American table tennis team received an invitation to visit China. Kissinger argues that this historic opening did not result from ideological change. It resulted from a change in the balance of power. Once both governments recognized that their common strategic interests outweighed their differences, the path toward reconciliation became possible. Chapter 9. The first meetings with Mao and Zhu. In July 1971, Kissinger secretly traveled from Pakistan to Beijing, where he spent 2 days in intensive discussions with Premier Zhou Enlai. These meetings reopened communication after more than 20 years without diplomatic relations. Kissinger describes Zhou as the finest statesman he encountered throughout his career, calm, precise, intellectually disciplined, and exceptionally skilled in understanding his counterpart. Mao Zedong presented a striking contrast. He preferred metaphor, humor, and philosophical reflection over detailed negotiation. Above all, Mao wanted China to be treated as an equal power, not as a country seeking American approval. The discussions centered on Taiwan, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet threat. The two sides did not solve their disagreements. Instead, they agreed not to let those disagreements prevent cooperation. 7 months later, President Nixon arrived in Beijing. The Shanghai Communique, especially throughout its carefully drafted language on Taiwan, allowed both countries to cooperate without requiring complete agreement. Kissinger concludes that the breakthrough succeeded because both governments learned to manage differences rather than eliminate them. As Zhou Enlai predicted, our communique will shake the world, and it did. Chapter 10. The Quasi-Alliance. Between 1972 and 1975, China and the United States developed an unusual strategic partnership. Kissinger calls it a quasi-alliance, close cooperation without a formal alliance treaty. During these years, Mao appeared less as a revolutionary and more as a strategic realist. He proposed what he called the horizontal line, an informal alignment linking the United States, Europe, Japan, Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey to contain Soviet power. Ironically, the anti-imperialist leader now encouraged a stronger American global presence. Mao discussed broad strategic ideas. Zhou Enlai transformed those ideas into practical diplomacy. Despite their cooperation, both governments continued criticizing one another publicly. As Mao remarked, "Sometimes we criticize you and sometimes you criticize us. That is perfectly acceptable, as long as our common objective remains unchanged." China sought cooperation while preserving complete independence. When Kissinger suggested establishing a nuclear emergency hotline, Mao joked that China did not need anyone else's umbrella. The relationship was shaken by the Watergate scandal and Zhou Enlai's departure from active politics. Yet Kissinger argues that the partnership survived because it rested not on personalities, but on shared strategic interests. As long as the Soviet Union remained the common challenge, cooperation continued. Chapter 12. Deng the Indomitable. Kissinger begins with a memorable observation. Only those who experienced Mao's China can fully experience the magnitude of Deng Xiaoping's achievement. Purged from power 3 times, Deng spent years in internal exile during the Cultural Revolution. His son was permanently disabled after an attack by Red Guards. Yet, Deng rarely mentioned these personal tragedies. When Kissinger met him, he encountered a leader entirely different from Mao. Practical, direct, energetic, and focused on results rather than ideology. Deng's famous principle became the symbol of China's transformation. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. He insisted that poverty was not socialism. He dismantled the communes, encouraged overseas education, and launched market-oriented reforms. Every policy was judged by one simple question: does it work? Kissinger summarizes the contrast elegantly. Mao relied on the people's willingness to endure hardship, then released their capacity for innovation. Although he never occupied China's highest formal office, he became the country's decisive leader. In December 1978, Deng launched the policy of reform and opening up, ending with words that captured the spirit of modern China. This time we must get it right. We have made enough mistakes. Chapter 15. Tiananmen Square. By early 1989, China enjoyed its strongest international position since 1949. Relations with the United States were improving. The economy was growing rapidly. Deng's reforms appeared remarkably successful. Then the death of the reform-minded Hu Yaobang sparked student demonstration that quickly exposed into nationwide demands for political reform, freedom of the press, and action against corruption. Deng interpreted the protest through the painful memory of the Cultural Revolution. He feared that political instability could once again threaten the unity of Chinese state. After weeks of internal debate, the communist leadership ordered the People's Liberation Army to clear Tiananmen Square on June 4. When Kissinger visited Beijing later that year, Deng defended the decision, arguing that failure to act could have led to civil war. Kissinger also notes that President George H.W. Bush chose to preserve communication with Beijing despite intense domestic criticism, believing that isolating China served neither American interest nor global stability. For Kissinger, Tiananmen exposed a fundamental difference between China and the West. Western governments tend to judge legitimacy primarily through individual liberty. China's leaders believe legitimacy rests first on preserving national stability and unity. Chapter 18. The New Millennium. With the emergence of new generations of leaders under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, China's focus shifted from economic survival to shaping the international order. China had become the world's second-largest economy and an increasingly influential global actor. Yet its leaders continued to emphasize strategic patience, gradual influence, and avoidance of direct confrontation. Their vision of China's peaceful rise reflected enduring elements of traditional Chinese statecraft. Kissinger warns that the greatest danger lies not in China's growing power itself, but in mutual misunderstanding. If each side automatically interprets the other's action as hostile, rivalry can become self-fulfilling. His proposed solution is what he calls co-evolution: competition where necessary, cooperation where possible, dialogue always. This, he argues, offers the best chance of avoiding conflict between the world's two most powerful nations. Kissinger's final reflections. Does history repeat itself? Kissinger closes the book with a question inspired by British diplomat Sir Eyre Crowe, who warned in 1907 about the rise of Germany. Is today's China becoming another Germany? His answer is cautious. China is indeed a rising power seeking a greater international role. But unlike Imperial Germany, it faces enormous domestic challenges, including uneven development and an aging population. For that reason, China's leaders remain focused primarily on stability and continued economic growth. The greatest danger, Kissinger argues, is not China's rise itself, but what he calls the Crow trap. If an established power interprets every move by a rising power as aggressive, while the rising power sees every response as an attempt at containment, both sides can become locked in a cycle of suspicion that eventually leads to conflict, even when neither actually wants war. Therefore, competition between China and the United States must be managed through dialogue, cooperation where interests overlap, and careful management of disagreements. Kissinger ends with Zhou Enlai's famous words, "Our communique will shake the world." Then he adds his own hope. What a magnificent conclusion it would be if 40 years later the United States and China were working together not to shake the world, but to build it. A brief look at the main criticisms of the book on China. Like any influential book, On China has attracted thoughtful criticism. One criticism is that Kissinger occasionally moves from historical analysis into personal memoir, making it difficult to separate the historical narrative from his own role in the events. In response, many readers argue that his first-hand experience is precisely what gives the book its unique value, offering insights unavailable to most historians. A second criticism is that the book devotes relatively little attention to China's long history before Mao. In response, supporters note that On China was never intended to be a comprehensive history of China, but rather an examination of its strategic culture and modern diplomacy. Perhaps the strongest criticism concerns Mao's domestic campaigns. Many scholars believe Kissinger discusses tragedies such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution with too little moral judgment. In response, defenders argue that the book's primary purpose is to explain China's strategic thinking, not to provide a moral evaluation of Chinese history. Finally, some critics believe Kissinger's concept of coevolution appears overly optimistic in light of the growing strategic rivalry between the United States and China. In response, supporters maintain that Kissinger presented coevolution not as a prediction, but as a strategic framework for reducing the risk of great power conflict. Conclusion. On China is far more than a history of a single country. It is an attempt to explain the strategic culture and historical mindset of a civilization that has become one of the defining powers of the 21st century. Kissinger argues that China cannot be understood through Western political assumptions alone. Its behavior reflects thousands of years of history, a tradition of strategic patience, and a deep concern for sovereignty, stability, and national unity. Whether one agrees with all of Kissinger's conclusions or not, the book offers an essential framework for understanding how China's leaders view the world and why that perspective matters for the future of international politics. The most important lesson Kissinger offers is this: before judging China, we must first understand the historical and civilizational logic that has shaped it for thousands of years. Closing remarks. Thank you very much for listening. Producing each episode of Khodaee Book Summary requires extensive research, careful reading, writing, narration, recording, and editing. Creating an accurate and well-researched summary is a demanding process that typically takes about a week of dedicated work. All of these summaries are offered free of charge and will continue to be freely available. If you would like to support this project, you are welcome to make a voluntary contribution of any amount. You'll find the support link in the description of this episode. You can also support the channel by liking this episode, sharing it with others, and leaving a comment. Your support helps more people discover these book summaries. Follow Khodaee Book Summary on YouTube, Spotify, Castbox, and Telegram. Simply search for Khodaee Book Summary or find us on Telegram at Khodaee Book Summary. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.